the family will be devastated by this, but we stick behind him because we know he's not guilty, as do all his friends.
They embarrassed him.
And so he killed him.
They embarrassed him. And you know, anybody, I don't care who you are, and whether you have a temper or you don't have a temper, nobody wants to be embarrassed.
I don't like the way it was handled. I want to save your life, that's all. We're just here, we're going to save his life. We want him to get life in prison. It was like they already knew he was guilty.
I love everything. Fire spreading all around my room. My world's so bright, it's hard to breathe, but that's alright.
The recent Netflix documentary The Murderer Next Door has once again highlighted the tragic case of Shanann and her babies, Cece, Bella and little Nico, taken from the world and disposed of in an abhorrent way by Christopher Lee Watts in the early hours of the 13th of August 2018. The documentary highlighted the bashing of the victims in this case, and sadly there has again been a resurgence of this behaviour in the wake of the documentary. To those of us who were on YouTube at the time and are advocates of victims, it was apparent as the case broke and many months afterwards that this bashing would not go away. We were aware of something not shown in the documentary, and that was a common factor in much of this bashing of Shanann Watts, and that was contact by the alleged creators with members of the Watts family. So why go out of your way to blame someone else for their own death? Why write a book named All My Broken Pieces, which continued to blame Shanann for what happened? One line being, "My son married a woman that was wrong for him and began to lose himself, and we began to lose him as well." And then to align yourself with notably bad people to pursue the futile task of trying to exonerate a clearly guilty man. Is it because he's a son? Maybe, but I'm not sure that it is. I believe it's about perceived culpability. Hers. If this is the case, does she need to feel responsible that her son murdered his wife, 2 daughters and unborn son? Does it need to be the fault of his upbringing, that he appears to have no real emotion, or that he'd rather annihilate his family and pretend they'd run off and left him, which if Nicole Atkinson hadn't been on her toes, that's what would have happened, then be perceived as a bad guy who got a divorce because he had an affair? In my opinion, Watts is a psychopath, where they do not feel much. They do feel physical pleasure and also shame, guilt, embarrassment, anger. This explains the affair and his determination not to be judged as a monster. I have done work on victim blaming previously, and it became apparent that it is generally based in some sort of denial, either because they believe the victim must be to blame, because if not, then this could easily happen to them also, or as part of some just world hypothesis where these things just don't happen to innocent people. This argument sadly doesn't get you very far when it comes to the murders of children. When researching this video, I came upon the work of Dr. Elizabeth Yardley, who is Professor of Criminology and Director of Birmingham City University Centre for Applied Criminology. She, of course, states rightly that what goes into a murderer's makeup is far more than just their parenting. However, she puts the emphasis on the mother's role because of which she calls the inherently gendered nature of society. So this is about what we expect from mothers, whether it's realistic or not, that nurturing, ever-loving mother role placed upon us, all mothers, by society. So we're going to look at some of the examples of the 3 kinds of mothers that Dr. Yardley feels are contributors to the making of murderers. We're going to look at some examples of that from historical cases of murderers, and then finally we're going to use this criteria to examine Cindy Watts' possible contribution to what Chris Watts ultimately did. Often victims of trauma themselves, these mothers turn into ruthless aggressors, the same kind of aggressors that they had previously had in their lives. Some examples of this kind of mother are Fred West's mother, who it is claimed actively abused Fred in every way, and yet he still loved and admired her. This abusive behaviour was normalised and carried through to his own home life with Rose West, who was also from an abusive household, and the wrong kind of history was made.
Fierce, plump, plain. Always wore a very thick leather belt, which she set about her children with relentlessly, as she would always be the one responsible for punishment.
Ed Kemper spoke of his long-term abuse from his mother. FBI Special Agent John Douglas, yes, that John Douglas, the killer across the table, Mindhunter John Douglas, said that his mother's verbal abuse was incessant, and she often told Kemper that he was nothing and that he would never amount to anything. So he's angry at Mum, said Douglas, but rather than strike out at Mum at this point, he's going on the hunt. It was the only way he felt he had power. Kemper claims he murdered his mother because he feels his own serial killing will then end. He said every time he murdered a woman, he was emulating the fantasy of killing Mom.
And that's when I decided I'm going to murder my mother. I knew a week before she died I was going to kill her. And she went out to a party, she got soused, she came home, went to sleep. I was woken up by that, came out. I walked up to her bed. She's laying there reading a paperback, as many thousands of nights before. And she said, "Oh, I suppose you're going to want to sit up all night and talk now." For 7 years, she said, I haven't had sex with a man because of you, my murderous son. This is one of our arguments. I cut off her head, and I humiliated her corpse. I said, there, you know? A 6 young woman dead because of the way she raises her son and the way her son is raised, the way he grows up. And what's her closing words? I suppose you want to sit up all night and talk.
Kemper had previously murdered his paternal grandparents, and while this could have been an attempt on his part to get back into his mother's care, it is important to remember that although mothers can be a factor in a murderer's makeup, final decision to kill was made by Kemper himself. Uber mothers are a product of the societal pressures that we put on people to succeed, and they never quite were up to scratch, as it were, and they're determined that their children will not suffer from the perceived disadvantages that they believe they had. They won't let poverty or disadvantage hold their children back. They become mother managers who carefully chart the childhood and adolescence of their children and struggle to keep them on course and also protect them from the outside world and from scrutiny as their behaviour becomes steadily more deviant. Harold Shipman very likely had an Uber mother. They grew up in hard times and she strove to overcome the setbacks that the family have. Harold was very close to Vera, who died from lung cancer when he was just 17 years old. However, before she passed away, she left him with a sense of superiority that meant it was difficult for people to be around him and for him to make friends, leaving him somewhat isolated. He nursed his mum as she died and was reportedly fascinated by how she reacted to the morphine doses he gave her. Harold went on to medical school, as no doubt his mother would have wanted. But it is alleged that the impact of his mother's death was what motivated Harold to go on to kill 250 people with morphine overdoses.
Good evening. The Manchester GP, Harold Shipman, is tonight starting 15 life sentences for murder, making him Britain's worst serial killer of modern times.
Passive mothers live in fear of being judged by society. Due to their quiet and subdued nature, when their children show any moral ineptitudes or deficiencies in school or anywhere else, they will respond through denial and ignore very important issues, dismissing them as phases. Ted Bundy's mother was in denial and declared his innocence throughout, and then when played his confession, she asked if anybody wanted refreshments.
The jury is totally wrong. They didn't take enough time. How could you consider all those momentous decisions in 6 hours? It's just impossible. It's wrong. We'll appeal it. It's just... What else can I say? The family will be devastated by this, but we stick behind him because we know he's not guilty, as do all his friends. That's it.
Todd Kohlepp's mother denied his guilt, and when Todd confessed to her, she dismissed this as being because he was embarrassed. And nobody liked to be embarrassed.
Well, the people that understand him and know him now just don't understand that Todd could do this. This is not the man they know. I could ask Todd for anything, and he would get it for me.
Dennis Nilsen's mother has flatly refused to talk about his crimes, and given that Dennis admits to abusing his siblings as a youngster, may have turned a blind eye in the home as well.
You can be born with a flaw which you've got to keep under control. If you don't keep it under control, it's your fault.
There is evidence to support that Cindy Watts has elements of all three of Dr. Yardley's highlighted mothering styles related to raising a killer. In the anti-mother aspect, well, we have no reason to think that Cindy ever raised a hand to Chris. However, there is evidence that she was manipulative, which in multiple forms could constitute abuse, and also that Chris needed protection from her. Instances of manipulation include withdrawal of love. This means the withdrawing of family contact when they had a falling out with Shanann over having potentially lethal peanuts around Celeste. Cindy and Ronnie refused to see Chris during this time. The refusal to attend the wedding because they did not agree with Chris's choice of bride was deeply manipulative. Not only this, but was an attempt to ruin that day for their son, playing on the fundamental attachment to his mother and her love to cause pain and therefore coerce.
We didn't attend because Shanann and I just couldn't get along, and I didn't like the way she treated him.
There is evidence to support that Chris was afraid of his mother, such as Ronnie not telling Cindy about the result of police questioning and Chris asking for only his father to come to attend Frederick when he was being questioned. Why would you not turn to your mother, the person who should love you unconditionally? Well, because she didn't in Chris's mind. She loved him conditionally, and he had learned this from being rejected for his choices. Shanann also referred to Chris needing to be protected from his mother in the discovery documents. Shanann did not know she was going to be horribly murdered. She had no reason to think anyone else but she and Chris would see this conversation. But there it is. In the Uber mother aspect, we hear Cindy talking about NASCAR, how they sent him to be trained, and bragging about his minimal achievements, being into sports and a mechanic. We see the mother-manager aspect of the Uber mother in wanting to be present to supervise his plea or his trial. If Chris is an adult, and if this is his decision, why did she need to be there? The answer is that she did not, but felt the need to be.
Going on. Let us ask Chris if it's okay if you talk to us. I just don't like the way it was handled from the very beginning. I don't like the way it was handled. I want to save your life. That's all. We're just here. We're going to save his life. We want him to get life in prison. It was like they already knew he was guilty.
The passive element of the mothering style is apparent. Although Cindy doesn't fit the quiet mothering style, her capacity for denial is actually so strong it's overt. When she says things like, there's not one person you can talk to that will say anything bad about this kid. He was just normal. He didn't have a temper. He was just easygoing like his dad. He's not a monster. Christopher, I don't see him of being capable at all, but if something happened that night and it happened, God forbid it did happen, why? What was the trigger? Why? What happened? I just want the truth, because he's not the sociopath next door. He's not the kind of person who would do something like that. I have to know why. Of course, this is Cindy seeking for something else or someone else to blame. But perhaps the best way to illustrate Cindy's capacity for vexatious denial is to compare her with other passive mothers, in this case the mothers of Ted Bundy and Todd Kohlepp, who were seen earlier as examples. These are longer clips to allow for comparison and noting of the similarities between them.
We still don't believe it. It just can't be. I keep shaking my head saying, how can this be? Because he had lots of friends, very good student in school, a very normal, active boy.
And he was in basketball, he was in baseball, he was in football, and loved NASCAR. He and his dad went to the NASCAR races all the time. Loved sports. And he was a good kid. Had two best friends, and that's who he grew up with, and still are friends with them today. And there's nothing that would have predicted any of this could have ever happened.
Yeah.
Nothing in his childhood at all.
Don't understand that Todd could do this, because this is not the man they know. I could ask Todd for anything, and he would get it for me. He had everything going for him. But it's not like he went out daily and killed somebody. There was a lot of time between the first ones and then the others.
So in conclusion, was Cindy Watts responsible for what Chris Watts did? No, absolutely not. This was Christopher's decision, not hers. The same with Bundy, Kohlepp, Kemper, Shipman. It was their decision to murder. So does Cindy need to blame herself for that? The coercion and refusal to accept Chris's choices certainly would not have helped, but do I think she knew her son would have that on his mind and then go on to kill? Also, no. What Cindy needs is to be responsible for her own actions, and the actions she has committed to since her son murdered her two grandchildren, her unborn grandson and Shanann Rozek. The overt denial, what could only be referred to as spite, and blaming of her own daughter-in-law over social media have not only cast huge doubts over her own character, but arguably make Chris look worse. The recent fuss over the alleged appeal, when paperwork has been filed to utterly prevent that, is an insult to the deep grieving of the Rozek family, who supported Shanann and Chris on their wedding day, did not seek vengeance on Chris, and are fighting daily battles against false information perpetuated by fools on social media. Before I bring this video to a close, I'd like to bring us back to this quote. Yes, people consider the backgrounds of murderers. It's a commonly used tool in behavioural science. But I don't feel that this comment is a complaint so much as a fear of what people will think of them, that they will judge them for Chris's actions. Truth be told, the majority of people would not judge you for Chris's actions, but they will judge you for your own.